Thank you so much for joining us for this Holding Court episode of the Dukes of Dice. This is one of our Patreon interview segments. It's been a long time since we've done one of these, but we're coming back with a good one because I have with me Emerson Matsuuchi. Emerson, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Alex. How are things going?
I'm doing pretty well. Emerson, for folks who don't know, and we'll talk through a lot of these games, but famous for Century Spice Road, Reef, Specter Ops, and the upcoming Metal Gear Solid board game. It's quite a lengthy resume, Emerson.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and a prolific, especially in recent years.
Yeah, actually, I'm fairly new to this industry. So my first game came out in 2013. So I've not been designing for very long.
But you've been designing very well, at least in the short period of time. So let's get into the gaming background. Where did you first fall in love with gaming?
Wow, I've loved games ever since I was a kid, for sure. Probably one of my earliest loves was a Risk-like game. At that time, it was called Shogun. It's gone through several name changes. I believe it was called Samurai Swords at one point, and I believe the latest incarnation is called Ikusa. But I think that it may have gone through another change. But it was super enamored with that game. The ninja was like the coolest little piece. I can't remember exactly what it does now because it's been so long. But I've loved board games for the majority of my life.
What was it about them that attracted you?
Gosh, there was a lot of fun that you can have, and in such an engaging experience with just plastic pieces and cardboard. And just the purity of the medium was always something that attracted me. At that time, I really enjoyed just having social time with friends. So we always liked to play games, and I remember when I was younger, I played with Transformers and G.I. Joes as a kid in the 80s. And, my friend would say, bang, bang, your guy dies, right? And I would say, well, why did my guy die and not yours? Because it looked like we shot at the same time, and, the way we played it lacked structure, and I think I always craved having the structure, and board games provided that structure of resolving these types of conflicts. And so it made it a game where I felt things were fair, and I really liked that you have these rules in play. So I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. Were video games a thing as well, or was it just kind of that tabletop experience that you tended to crave?
In my early life, it was all tabletop games. So playing Risk and Monopoly, and probably one of the first games that I played that I really really enjoyed was. It's a Japanese game called shogi. It's probably like the Asian equivalent of chess. So a lot of the pieces move in the same way. And for that one, I play with my father, and I've got hundreds and hundreds of plays of that game. Not that made me very good, because I was still, I was like a 10-year-old kid at the time, and my father would actually start the board with pieces missing, just as a form of handicap. So, but it was a game that I always we played it almost every night, as long as I wasn't grounded. So one of the forms of punishment for me was that I couldn't play games. So if I was grounded, I couldn't play games. So you could see that it was definitely something that I gravitated towards, something I always wanted to do. But video games did become much more prevalent in my teen years. So. Getting, say, the Nintendo, the original Nintendo Entertainment System, all the way through. To a certain extent, I still play video games now as well, but just not as often. And I treat video games now how I believe a lot of board gamers treat solo modes of board games. Is that if I really want to play a game, but I don't have anyone to play with, then instead of turning to a board game, the solo mode of a board game, I go to a video game.
Yeah, that tends to be how I would handle things as well. So what did you had this deep-seated love for games, this long-time passion for games. What did you do with that passion before you got into designing? Because as you mentioned, you've only been designing in terms of board games for the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Actually, I should probably clarify that, because I have been designing games since I was a kid. None of them were any good, but it was only recently that I tried to actually design games in a more professional capacity. But before that, I think my earliest game was when I'm going to venture to say around 8. And that's also around the time that I got into Dungeons and Dragons, which was also a big part of my childhood. So if you ever watched the opening scene of Stranger Things season one, that was my life right there. It was so nostalgic to me. But my first endeavor into designing was just creating adventures in Dungeons and Dragons, and then trying to spin off the rules of it and retheme it to like robots fighting or giant robots. So kind of like the Robotech before there was the Robotech role-playing game.
Gotcha. What were some favorite characters or favorite or memorable moments from your D&D career?
Oh, geez, gosh. Let's see. We've got, well, there's always those, you have a critical roll you need to hit, and you roll that one, a natural one on the 20. It wasn't, it's not bad enough that you miss, but you roll a one, you have to roll in the critical misses table and things like that. Those are always great moments. But I had a strong attachment to like the characters. So this may not be like a great memory, but it was something that was very memorable. Is that when your characters die, you felt that a part of you also died as well because you invested a lot in those characters. And I think that was like the first time that in a game you vested yourself so much into a piece of paper, essentially.
I mean, you're with that character for so long, right? You try and embody that character. You try and think of what they would do. You try and live through their shoes. And yeah, it only makes sense that you get that attachment that grows with you.
Yeah.
So what kind of career have you been in, or maybe are still in? I'm actually not sure if you do this full time yet or not, Emerson. But what kind of career were you doing while still having this passion for games on the side?
Oh, I guess I started as a graphic designer, web designer, got into IT, information technologies. I became professionally as a programmer for, it's 15, 20 years. I was doing that professionally for different companies before back in 2012 when I decided to do game design at a more serious capacity. I was a consultant. I would work on different software development projects, usually large firms that they have some particular very niche need, and they need some software to do something that I guess in-house teams couldn't do. My partners and I, we would go in and develop software that is customized and specialized. So we would fill like the niche needs at that time. But prior to that, I was a software development, I guess, manager. So I would run a team of programmers. A lot of them were offshore based, so I did a lot of management, a little bit less programming, which wasn't as satisfying. I guess I'm more of a hands-on type of a person. And whether I still do it, it's I never officially said that I'm doing game design full time, but it has been something I have been doing for the past 2.5, 3 years. Is I've only been doing game design, so I have not been doing software development. So in a way, I guess I am now a full-time game designer.
Mm. What had you flip the switch to devoting more of your time to doing this professionally? What happened in 2012 that had you say, I think I can do this?
I think at that time, because the nature of consulting work was that you would get projects and then there will be these long lulls of time, usually during like the summer months or after companies get their budgeting outlook. Then they know how much they can allocate to different projects, and that's usually the time that we would get contracted. And it was a type of career path where you would really have to kind of ride out the waves. So sometimes you would get a lot of projects, and I remember I was working 2 projects simultaneously. Luckily, they're in different time zones, so I was working 16-hour days for several months because we had multiple projects that we were working on. And then there were months that we had absolutely no projects. And I thought, okay, well, what's a good way to kind of fill that gap of time in there? Do something kind of productive, something I've always wanted to do. And I decided, hey, I always liked designing games. That's always been like a passion. I wanted to do it in some capacity or another. So, and I wanted to create apps because I wanted to kind of utilize the skills that I already had and create little video game apps. But I had no idea how to design a game. So that's when I started, and I went back to going with the analog route and decided, well, let's try it with, create a simple card game. Let's start with that, right? see how far I could take. And I really enjoyed that process. And I wanted to explore like the logistics of how to create a card game, get it out to, first get it produced, get the graphics done, and publish it and get it through distribution. I wanted to see how that process worked. And so that's when I delved into it back in 2012, 2013.
And was that first game Tricks and Treats?
That first game was Tricks and Treats.
The game of candy and cunning for 2 to 4 players. I am very good at having BGG up at the same time as these interviews, so let's not pretend I'm very impressive at this. So, no, I have it in front of me. It was put out by Nazca Games. What did you learn during that first game, during the creation of that first game, that really informed your design career? What were some of the big takeaways you had from getting Tricks and Treats from concept to reality?
Oh, it was a fulfilling process. Like it's different when you create software, you're creating something in a virtual space. It's not tangible. You can't touch it. You can't feel it. You can't see the intrinsic value of it immediately. But with creating something like a board game or a card game, it's a physical product. You can hold it. You can touch it. You can feel it. You can see the value of what you just did.
Yeah.
So that was one of the takeaways from it.
Were there things or steps that you took at the time then that you completely would not do now, that would be just completely out of the picture? There's no way Emerson now would do what Emerson back then did.
Oh, okay. One thing is that a seasonal theme doesn't sell well except within that season. So I think from now on I may shy away from doing seasonal themes unless it's something phenomenal and that theme is the only real fit for it. But yeah, that's one thing that I would shy away from.
Specter Ops Christmas Edition not coming anytime soon?
I don't think so.
What about 4th of July edition? Maybe you could have fireworks in the game somehow? I don't know how that would work.
Maybe. You know what might work is to have a series of games, each one based on a different holiday, and then you would sell it as a pack. That way there's always something that you can play that's relevant.
There you go.
So that might be a spin.
You've already got one game checked off there. You've already got Halloween handled. Now you just have to come up with the rest of the holidays. Although I think it'd be hard to compete with Arboretum for something like, say, Arbor Day. So I think you'd probably need to steer in a different direction.
Right. Now, it could be a collection of games.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a publisher that would be interested in a collection of games that could fit all the different holidays and, not... What do you call those one-off days? Like there's a National Donut Day. What would you call those?
Oh, sure. Are you talking about the ones that are... So having been in TV news, we would get press releases on these completely made-up holidays all the time. Kind of these corporate-inspired ones like Shop Till You Drop Day, or it's National Talk Like a Pirate Day, which is, I don't think it's corporate, but is just kind of made up. I don't know what the name for that is. I think they're just called holidays, but... I call them nonsense holidays. Maybe Hallmark holidays gets a term thrown around.
Okay, a Hallmark holiday, yeah.
But I don't think Hallmark would be so pleased with having their name on that necessarily.
Yeah. So
I don't know.
Yeah, it might be something that a publisher might be interested in, is getting a collection of games that fits those holidays.
Maybe. I don't know. I'd have to ask some publishers I know. All right. Specter Ops comes along a few years after that, and if I'm looking through your design catalog, I think that, fair to say, is the next big hit in the line. I don't want to gloss over things, but Specter Ops is really the one that puts you on the map.
Absolutely. I would say it's the first quote unquote hit that I had is Specter Ops for sure.
So how did the idea for that game come about? Had you enjoyed hidden movement games prior to this?
So that one has an interesting story. At first, I was still of the mind that I had a lot more confidence in my programming skill and a lot less confidence in my game design skill. So I kept leaning towards, well, how can I leverage what I'm strong at? So initially, Specter Ops, the idea for it came as a video game. I was initially planning to make it a video game. It was going to be a first-person video game where it's one person against a team. That one person is actually trying to hide from the other 4 people. It was going to be first person, and the structure of the game was that the team would be police that were looking for a suspect. The police would have like some pictures and some bits of information of what the suspect looks like. But they have a large area to actually comb through to try to find this suspect. But they would have dogs, they would be able to tap cell phones and so forth. So there will be some mechanics to allow them to get closer and closer to the suspect. Now the player who's playing the suspect has the advantage that he can blend in a lot more with the crowd. So if the police players see somebody running erratically through a crowd of AI-controlled people, obviously he's going to put himself out. But if that player is just walking casually, trying to blend in with the crowd, it's going to make him much more harder to notice. So it was supposed to be a one versus many game on as a video game. And then a friend of mine says, well, you're into board games, because at that time when I was playing a lot of Ticket to Ride and Catan and those type of games, he said to me, have you thought of making a board game? And my first response was like, no, you can't make, that might be possible. So I stopped myself mid-sentence. I said, that might be possible. Let me try it. So I created a little paper prototype, and just to see if that notion would work on paper. And that's when I came to hidden movement as a mechanism. So I explored that a little bit more. And that's how Specter Ops started, was that idea and trying to make it an analog experience.
And how did it evolve from there? How did it get to where it becomes this hunting experience, right? That carried through, but obviously there were different ideas that got incorporated as you went.
Yeah, absolutely. It did start off, the first paper first board game prototype. It was two police in a car, and they were trying to chase. I should probably explain that the idea for the video game came from watching a TV show, which was Cops. And in that, there was one scene that really got me thinking, that there were two policemen they got a call to find a suspect, and they were describing the suspect. And the poor camera guy was trying to keep up with these cops as they were chasing down the suspect.
Right.
So just the idea that the adrenaline that they must be feeling on both sides, right, as a suspect and as the police, it must be like through the roof. And I thought, wow, it would be really cool to try to capture that in a game. So then it went to the video game, and then to the analog game. And then the first prototype had two policemen in a police car chasing a suspect. And initially, there wasn't enough depth to it, and it became quite algorithmic as to how you would capture the suspect. So I introduced more and more nuances to it, so adding certain abilities on both sides, so giving the suspect the ability to evade the police in certain ways, while the police would have ways to be able to narrow or close the net on them. And by doing so, I was introducing these special abilities. It made more sense for them to have thematic reasons to have these abilities. So then it started to switch from police chasing a suspect over to sort of like the Metal Gear or the Splinter Cell style aesthetics and theme.
Got it. Excellent. And what do you think when you got that game where you wanted it? And actually, let me go back a second, because it's interesting. You hear with design oftentimes that's oftentimes people will start with too many ideas and have to kind of strip some away. And it sounds like what happened with Specter Ops was kind of the opposite, where you had a very core idea, you had a very kind of a simple notion at the center of it, and then added complexity to it as you went. Do you find that tends to be how you design, where you start off with something simple and then add things to it?
I've actually gone in both directions. So in that particular case, it's more like the clay sculpture, where you're adding clay to build the form of the game. But in other ones, I have a whole lot of stuff, and I really need to streamline. So I start cutting away until I get to the part that is the core, the fun part of the game, and just try to put things, just cut away anything that doesn't amplify that fun experience. So I've approached it from both sides.
Yeah, and I think it kind of depends on where the design is, and obviously the more experience you get as a designer, the better you're going to be able to read when it needs to be added, when something needs to be taken away, and going from there.
Yeah, coincidentally, Century Spice Road was actually an exercise of taking like the Euro games that I really, really enjoyed, right? But there's always those certain aspects of the Euro games that I enjoyed when you're trading in a resource to get more. It's like, oh, I like that fulfilling feeling. And of course, you're getting those resources so that you can turn them in for victory points, which is always like a staple mechanic in a lot of Euro games. So that was an exercise of paring out everything else and just saying, well, what if I just pare it down to just that core that I really enjoy? And at first, I didn't think it was going to be a game. I didn't think it would work, but I just went through the exercise just to explore that space. And so, funny thing is that the initial prototype I made that just distilled it down to just trading the cubes isn't all that different from the Spice Road as it is now.
Did it have a different, and kind of changing gears, we'll get back to Specter Ops in a bit, but changing gears over to Century, did that have a different theme? What theme did it have, or what theme did you envision with that game?
The very first theme was no theme at all. It was actually cards that just had trading these cubes for these cubes. And then you would eventually you would trade those cubes for victory points. The only addition was that you had cards that allow you to expand the capacity, so increase the number of cubes that you could hold, which is absent from Spice Road. But that was really the only difference. And then later on, after I saw that the core mechanics really worked and it had a very, very satisfying gameplay to it, then the discussion theme came around where what kind of a theme would be good. And my initial thought when I was discussing this with other playtesters was I wanted a cyberpunk hacking theme to it. Now let me explain. So the cubes that you have in the game represented the different levels of access. So you had like green, which is low level access, all the way up to red, which was the highest level access. And then you would use those access to access the corporate files. So think kind of like Netrunner. So you're trying to access, the government's these corporations' agendas, and those would be worth victory points. And then the game would end once one player got their fifth agenda, and that would cause a lockdown. So all the players only had one final turn to do what they needed to do, and so forth. So I started with that theme, but then I was swayed to go away from that theme because if I put sort of like a cyberpunk cover on the box, the people who are looking for a cyberpunk experience are going to get a Euro game.
Right, and this is the ultimate Euro of Euros, as you mentioned. This is Euro, the quintessential Euro. So yeah, I can understand the need to have a theme that better fit that.
Right. So that's where the spice trading theme came in, is because if you put spice trading on the box, you're going to get what you're expecting when you see spice trading on a box. And I think we called it, the initial prototype was called Spice Road.
Okay, so it ended up pretty close to there name-wise. Very interesting. So this could have also been Century, All Your Base Are Belong to Us, potentially. Got it. I want to go back to Specter Ops and then kind of blend back into Century, because there was a topic that came to mind, and it reminded me of sort of getting to know you, Emerson, as a person. Because one of the, and it's not really the early episodes of the Dukes of Dice, we're on almost episode 200 now, but in episode 51, we reviewed Specter Ops. It was one of our very early reviews. And I remember we were at, and you might remember this convention better than I do, but this was a Sean story. During our review, I gave it, I think, a 4 or a 5 on the Ducal scale, and Sean was a little more mixed on it, not because of anything bad about the game itself, but more because hidden movement is just not a mechanic he really tends to like. And so he was down on it in his review score. And I recall he felt very awkward actually meeting you in person because, one, we didn't assume anyone actually listened to our show, or certainly that many people listened to our show. Two, that the designer of a game would listen to us review their game, although in retrospect it probably makes sense that they would. And I remember you two had an interaction where he had recalled, and I recall him telling me this, just feeling so embarrassed, and you could not have been nicer about the whole thing. About, I don't know if you remember it better than I do, but just incredibly gracious about that kind of thing.
It was at the, I think it was...
Was it Dice Tower Con?
Yeah, I'm thinking it was Dice Tower Con, and it was either before or after the live show that I sat down and I talked to Sean. And I came up to him just to thank him for that, very, very professionally done review, because it was a review that he recognized that it's not a game for him, right? And his scores would reflect that, obviously. But I mean, he didn't say that it was a bad design. It was just not fit for him. And the way he conveyed, his feeling towards it, I thought was he was very well spoken, and I was very impressed by that. So I wanted to thank him for coming up with a review that was, it was very heartfelt, it was very honest, and I felt that it was very, very professional, very courteous of him.
But what I'll tell you is, not that we have a ton of interactions with designers whose games we've reviewed, but in terms of a reaction to that, I remember he was just taken aback at how nice and how gracious you were in that moment. And it led me to this question, which we got on the Guild from Phil Hendrickson. Phil asks, when Century Spice Road was released, most reactions were very positive. Thus, the anticipation for Eastern Wonders was pretty high, yet the reviews were a little more mixed. Do you have any thoughts on why that was? But my question kind of stemming from that too is, how do you take feedback? How do you be gracious in the face of negativity? Because anytime you put something out in the world, it's not going to be universally loved.
Right. So I guess going with the first question from the Guild, I did get to see the questions a little bit ahead of time, and I was actually trying to look at the reviews I guess I've been mostly sticking with the video reviews, so I haven't seen a lot of the negative reviews for Eastern Wonders. Looking at the BGG score, they're about the same as...
They're identical. Yeah, I was looking at that too. It's actually slightly higher. It's 7.43 on average versus 7.41. So yeah, that first part of it, I think that it doesn't have as many ratings, certainly as Century Spice Road, but you don't tend to find that with sequels either.
Right. So I wasn't sure quite how to answer that, but in terms of like the feedback, Century Spice Road, I think, was very well received. I do get a lot of people say to me how much they really enjoy the game. Not so much with Eastern Wonders, and it's a game that hasn't sold as well as Spice Road, but it's also a bit of a heavier game as well. So I think one of my concerns when I designed Eastern Wonders was, am I alienating the Spice Road audience that really likes that weight of a game? I added something a little bit more, but I think maybe did I up the complexity just a couple notches higher than what the audience would like. So I did learn one lesson from that, in that I think that the Century name kind of instills that, hey, this is a very approachable, very gateway style game. So with the third game, I tried to reel it back, because I did have an initial design that was even heavier. I would say twice as heavy as Eastern Wonders in terms of like the amount, the cognitive load and the forward planning required to do well in the game. So it was spatial, but it was also, there was like another dimension to the spatiality of it, which hopefully would turn into its own game. But with the third game, I decided, I'm going to change it, and at one point I started from scratch. With a clean slate, I decided, I'm going to get something that's more approachable. So I reworked the whole design to something that it had an incredibly simple rule set, but also I wanted it to be a different experience too. So I went with a worker placement. It's a modified worker placement, where it doesn't have like all the standard trappings of a worker placement. And it has a little bit more of an engine building aspect to it. As you get cards, your abilities you're stronger and stronger as the game goes on. So I took that approach with it.
When are we going to see, and that Century, a New World, right?
That's correct.
The third one in the series?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you have a sense on when that's likely to come out?
That'll be Origins.
Origins, okay, not too far away now.
I think that's a soft. I don't have all the information, so please don't quote me, but I believe it's a soft launch. So it'll be available at Origins, but I don't think it's going to hit retail until later in the year.
Sure, I gotcha. Yeah, then and that's fairly typical. And for folks who maybe aren't aware of this on the outside of the industry, designers don't always necessarily know exactly when their title's going to drop at any given time. But some publishers are better at communicating some of that information than others, for sure.
Plus, the publishers don't know because they're not quite sure when the boat will actually make it to port.
Yep, I've certainly experienced that plenty of times. Or sometimes the boat will hit the port and it's very crowded in LA at the rail yards, and they can't get things loaded on for an extra 2 or 3 weeks, and you get very frustrated. Yeah, I'm recently familiar with this notion. Very, very familiar. Yeah, it can be a bit brutal sometimes. But to the other question, because as positively received as both games are, looking at the average scores, there is always the occasional negative review, and some of them, in the board game industry, there's less toxicity, it feels like, than in something like, say, video games. But how do you respond when you see something that's a less favorable review of something that you're passionate about, something that you worked on and put your heart into?
Okay, so my usual reaction to negative reviews is that I kind of have to brace myself. So as much as I've done this, I do feel like I'm fairly nascent in this industry because negative reviews, like I have to tell myself, they're all learning opportunities. So I know at some point I'm getting better at the negative reviews, and I mean I completely agree that the toxicity and negativity is such there's so little of it in the board game industry, and that even the negative reviews, there are always a lot of positive things that they say about the game. But overall, their experience was negative and so forth. But I try to look at each one of those as a learning experience. And the more I design and I bring my prototypes to play testers, I'm always looking for that negative feedback. So I've gotten to really appreciate negative feedback because it's telling me where the weak points in the design are.
It's more beneficial to get them ahead of time, though, I would think, rather than once the game's released.
Ideally, but once a game is released, it's still a learning opportunity to see it. Once it's out there, right, in the masses, it's going to go, it's going to run into different types of experiences. So it's going to have a larger breadth of experiences than I could get in a playtest or within all these playtest sessions for a particular game. So it's an opportunity to learn from that as well.
Got it. When you're attacking a design, when you're going at a design, how often are you theme first and how often are you mechanics first? It seems like, at least with Century and Spectre, those tended to be more mechanics first.
I think Specter Ops was initially, it was all from that one episode of Cops.
Okay, got it.
So that might be more of a theme, or some people would say an experience first. Sure. Although I think the more and more, I feel like experience first design is still more on the thematic side because you're making design decisions on something other than the mechanics. So from those two standpoints, I think I flip-flop a lot. And I think that's maybe one of the weaknesses of my design style is that I'm very eclectic with my games. So as opposed to, say, someone like Uwe Rosenberg or Stefan Feld, who have a strength and really hone and develop their strengths, and they create a core audience and they cater to their audience. Whereas for me, this came up in a conversation where one person says, "Hey, I really love Specter Ops, so I'm going to go and get Century Spice Road." And I told him, well, before you do that, I need you to realize that they're very, very different games. So in that respect, like I don't think I'm a good designer to follow because my games don't appeal to the same audience necessarily. So
it seems like there's almost two categories of games that kind of emerge, though, right? Reef sort of has that Euro-y feel to it as well, similar to Century Spice Road. And Metal Gear Solid seems like it's going to be more in that Specter Ops category. We'll get into that dicey territory in a little bit here, but it seems like there's at least kind of two pools that the games tend to fall into.
Right. I do think that there's a large market, and I think maybe the market's kind of converging to a point where people are looking at, or people are expecting really good, sound, balanced, engaging mechanics, but also have incredibly strong thematic ties, a lot of good thematic integration between them. And so now for all my future designs, so I'm working on several projects, and I'm constantly looking at both sides because now I believe that the market has matured to the point that the expectation is there to not compromise on either side of that fence. You want good, solid, engaging mechanics. You want a game that tells a story. You want it to feel thematic, intuitive. They want everything, right? So I feel like designers now, we really need to step up our game to give the consumers what they want.
I gotcha. Going back to the guild, before we get into the elephant in the interview, so to speak, Jesse Black was curious, will there be any more expansions for Specter Ops? And then the follow-up question, when you play, do you prefer to play the hunter or the agent, and why?
Okay. Well, if it was up to me, absolutely. I would be coming up with a lot more Specter Ops expansions, as well as games that have a similar feel of running and hunting, but we're using different mechanics too. So I had some designs where there was no pad of paper. All the pieces are actually on the board. but you just didn't know which of the pieces was the real one. So there would be a lot of bluffing pieces and so forth. And I do like playing the agent more than the hunters, but just by a little bit. And I think the reason is that it is a very tense experience to be the agent. So there's always those moments when like I have to wiggle in my seat when the hunters start getting really close. And as stressful and tense as it is still a very enjoyable experience. But not everyone likes it. So, for instance, my wife absolutely hates that experience. So it's not for everybody.
When you have the hunters duped in that game, though, that's one of the more satisfying experiences you can have. It's the exact opposite, right? It's not necessarily tension, but it's sort of the tension of trying not to reveal too much or be too openly in people's face about something like that.
Right, absolutely. When you set up a trap for your opponents, so that there's that strong tension of hoping that they fall into that trap. So you may be in a position where one of two things will happen. Either they fall into the trap or you've blown your cover. So,
gotcha. All right, let's dive into dangerous territory here, Emerson, because I know that there's going to be some questions here you can answer and some questions you definitely can't. How did you first get involved with Metal Gear Solid, the board game?
Oh, okay. So this was back in. I had just a real brief conversation with Daryl Andrews, who is the designer of lots of great games. I think the most notable is Sagrada, which has been like a phenomenal hit. But I had a conversation with him. At that time, he was working with IDW, and IDW was acquiring different video game licenses. And one of the things that he reached out to me for was, are you interested in doing IP-based games? And I said, yeah, I guess it just depends on which IP. And he says, well, there are some IPs that they're looking into. And then he mentioned within that list Metal Gear Solid. And so I said, I'm incredibly interested in that particular IP. And so I guess that got the ball rolling. And because I've done Specter Ops, and I do have to say, I think it's because of Specter Ops that I was considered for to design this game. So I'm really, really fortunate in that regard. So I think that's sort of where the opportunity presented itself.
And when you first heard that you were the guy, you got the job, what was the emotion? What was the reaction? Was it thrilled? Was it worried? Was it some mix of both?
Oh, it was absolutely both. So when I got the contract, I was ecstatic, but at the same time, I would have to say probably the most diehard and critical fans are Metal Gear Solid fans. So I knew I had my work cut out for me. So there was a lot of different ways that I could have gone with the design, but I decided, you know what, I want to have the design tell the story. So because the story was probably one of the most phenomenal aspects of the game. It's one of the most memorable, and I remember very vividly each surprising twist in the game, each story. This was the first time that the antagonists, after you've defeated them, they tell you their story, and at that point you start to sympathize and realize that in this world that was created, is that the villains are villains because of circumstances, right? So, and it really changed the way, like, how I thought of games and how good guys and bad guys work, and it was such a inspirational and it was such an influential game to me that it's an incredible honor to be able to work on this.
When you knew you had that contract, what goes into the research end? Did you just have to go back and play every single Metal Gear Solid game you could get your hands on, or there are a handful of games that you focused on?
Actually, it's Metal Gear Solid. Since the license was specifically for Metal Gear Solid 1, I focused most of my research into that. I did go into Metal Gear Solid 2, 3, 4, and so forth, because I have all the games except for the couple that I've lent. But I did research, but I did kind of stop myself because I was starting to incorporate gameplay elements from Metal Gear Solid 2 into the game, and I realized, well, since the license is only for 1, and it does need to be approved by Konami, so I better stick with just what's in Metal Gear Solid 1. So I really focused my research just on that.
You're also setting it up to where, hey, if it goes successfully, sequel. I mean, you have that whole line of games. You just make versions of, you get Snake Eater and you get all sorts of ones in the mix.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that would be the dream, is to be able to do the other ones, and especially 3, because they changed the mechanics around, the stealth mechanics, to a camouflage mechanic, and I think that would be phenomenal to incorporate that or implement that in the board game.
Well, Nick Hayes was very curious about this. Had a number of questions, some of which you may be able to answer, maybe not. He was curious: will Metal Gear Solid, the board game, have its own story, or will it be an implementation of one of the video games that's already been released? And since we're talking about the first one, will it be an implementation of that story?
It will be an implementation of that story. So that part I believe we could say, because I believe the description on BGG does say that we are trying to tell the original story. But obviously some things have to change, because it is not just a single-player game. So the other characters will get involved, and because of that, some elements of the story have to change. So it'll be fairly faithful to the original story, but at necessary points it does diverge a little bit.
Let's see. Let's look at this one. All right. Mechanics. What kind of mechanics are we talking about with this game that gamers can expect? What is it at its core?
Okay, it is a tactical espionage action game, which it doesn't include hidden movement, which is one thing that I can say. So it is, since it's cooperative, it's not hidden movement. There is an AI to it. So the AI is actually what drives the genome soldiers and the bosses and so forth. But I'm not sure how much of the mechanics I can actually get into. It is cooperative, and it is going to there will be stealth aspects to it. So it does try to recreate some of the experiences of the video game, but obviously, incorporating the full experience of the video game into a board game is a very daunting task, and it starts to get to be quite unwieldy when you start to implement all the rules that are in the video game. So it has to be pared down to some degree, but I'm hoping that what I have does at least give you that same kind of experience of trying to evade the guards to try to get access, and also when you fight the bosses, that feels fairly thematic and representative of what they do in the video game.
Like it. All right. Very cool. Ossian Gur was curious, with such a rich universe of strange villains, are the bad guys playable in Metal Gear Solid?
Not in this version of the game. So, but there may be some things down the road where we can introduce something like that.
Okay. A couple little hints there. So you might be on to the right track there, Ossian Gur, but at least not initially, it doesn't sound like. What's the process like in working with an IP? When you're dealing with something that's this big, this important, this well known, what's the process like in terms of getting the design? Are there more layers of communication, more layers of approvals? What's that process like?
There's definitely a process of approval, but most of the time I have actually been shielded from that. IDW has been the one that goes to Konami with the approval process. Actually, I had mentioned that I need to provide an overview video to them to show how the gameplay works for their approval. But so far, I've actually been quite shielded from a lot of the interactions with another company. So, but I have been given hints as to these are the things that we should be doing. So, working with the IP, it does provide more constraints, and so you don't quite have all the design space that you may want. But sometimes for some designers, I know some designers, very well-known designers, that work really, really well within these constraints. I guess it's kind of like the notion that necessity is the mother of invention, or constraints the mother of invention. So for me, it's been a really interesting experience to try to work within that. One thing that does make it easier is that whenever I come to a decision point in the design and say, okay, should it work like this or should it work like that? It's very easy in that, okay, which way is more thematic? That seems to always answer the question for me.
Nice. Has working on this inspired you to try and seek out more IP-based design and work on more IPs?
Actually, in a way, yes. In that it's interesting. I find that the constraints make it a very interesting design challenge. And then also just to see how close to the original experience that you can get. Now, I'm not sure if the way I'm designing is the way that would make the most marketable product. In a way, I'm trying to kind of recreate the experience. The reason I'm doing that is that I feel that there's a lot of board gamers who have heard of Metal Gear Solid, but haven't experienced a video game, haven't experienced the story. So I could have made a game that is based on Metal Gear and the characters and so forth. But I wanted them to experience the story of it because I feel like that was one of the strongest parts of the video game.
And something you wanted to focus on in your design.
Yeah. So, but it may not be something you want to do with all games. So I was watching some IGN article or some videos and just some videos on the internet in regards to the Metal Gear Solid movie and the challenges of making a video game into a movie. It's a different. I was looking at it in terms of research as to how I should approach adapting the video game into a board game. But I found that it's a completely different challenge for movies in that most of the people who are going to watch the movie already know the story. So in a way that they want something familiar, but a different experience. But with the board game, I think I had a different direction that it came from, in that I felt that there's a lot of board gamers who are not familiar with it, and that they want to see the story of Metal Gear Solid.
I will be honest, I have never played a Metal Gear Solid game. If you had to recommend one, which one would you recommend?
Metal Gear Solid 1, absolutely.
Just start at the beginning. Okay.
Well, there is a beginning. So there's a game called Metal Gear, and that was on a much older platform, on the original NES platform. And then there was Metal Gear 2, Solid Snake, which was on like the MSX platform. So those are like much older consoles. So the first, I would say, dive into Metal Gear Solid 1, which is on the original PlayStation. Which, by the way, I went out and bought one of this. I know that the audience can't see this.
Yeah, no. It's a PS. What is that? They call them the PS Mini, or I can't remember what those are called.
I think it's just called the PlayStation Classic.
That's it. PlayStation Classic. Yep.
Although I would say check the reviews on it. The frame rate seems to be a little bit off on this particular unit. So, but it's a great way to. It's very cheap, and it's a great way to experience the first game.
Well, I did have a PlayStation back in the day, so I was familiar at least with the system. I never had that particular game for whatever reason. Interesting. If you could pick any other IP to work on, now that you have some, you've gotten your feet wet a little bit with a pretty big one, what would be your dream IP? The one that you would absolutely kill to design a game for?
Besides Metal Gear Solid?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see.
And this is Nick Hayes' question. I didn't come up with it. I'm stealing it from him.
Oh, there's definitely some other IPs that would be a dream to work with. Like, for instance, Game of Thrones would be great to work with. I know one IP that's incredibly difficult to get, and that might be why it's so appealing, is maybe Dune, which is one that I think Fantasy Flight wasn't able to acquire for their game Rex. So, but that one also has an incredibly rich universe, and those are kind of like the holy grail type of IPs for a designer who likes to design within those IP constraints.
That would be the dream.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to also just throw in one more, and that's SimCity.
SimCity, okay, interesting. Oh, very different tangent with that one. Okay, why SimCity?
I really enjoy the city building. I have a whole bunch of city building prototypes because I've been designing a bunch of city building games. But I feel like that one, I just love in SimCity, you can just watch your city just organically grow. So you make your decisions and then things start to just grow on their own. The city starts to come alive on its own. And to be able to create something like that on a tabletop would be really, really interesting.
I feel like SimCity would do very well if you could get that theme and put it over a cool city building game. Though I think The Sims might sell better.
Ultimately.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right about that.
This is in the category of Weird Alex question. Have you ever seen Space Jam? This is not the question, but it's kind of the setup to the question. Have you ever seen the movie Space Jam?
I have not seen the movie, but
Okay.
it's the one with the Bugs Bunny cast with Michael Jordan, correct?
Right, and there's the whole premise is there's aliens from outer space, and they've come and then they steal the powers from other NBA stars like Charles Barkley and several others of that day, and use that to then create an elite basketball team that then goes up against the Looney Tunes plus Michael Jordan. If you could, like the aliens in Space Jam, steal the design talent of any one designer and add it to your own, which designer would that be and why?
Ooh, that is a tough one. That is a tough one. If I could choose multiples, I have a whole list of designers. But if I had to choose only one, it may be...
You said you like working in constraints. There's a constraint right there.
There is a constraint right there. Okay, so... All right, so I'm paring it down. So I had a longer list, but I'm paring it down to, like, say... So I'm just going to rattle off some names. I'm just going to start to pare it down.
Okay, let's hear it.
So we got Eric Lang. We got Uwe Rosenberg. We have Sid Saxon, Vlaada Chvátil, Ignacy Trzewiczek. All right, so if I were to break those down, I personally think Vlaada Chvátil is an absolute brilliant genius. And Sid Saxon is a genius. He was way ahead of his time. So I'm narrowing it down to those two now. I'm going to go with Vlaada Chvátil.
Okay. Is it just because of the versatility in the designs?
Yes, I mean that's one thing is that whatever genre of games he designs for, I mean he makes an outstanding, genre-defining game, right? So you have Through the Ages, you have Mage Knight, you have Galaxy Trucker, you have Space Alert, you have Codenames. I mean, the guy is he makes gold, right? He's got the Midas touch. Whatever designs. I mean, he's had designs of varying success. But when he makes a hit, he makes an outstanding hit.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the track record has proven that for sure.
But all the designers I mentioned, and even some that I haven't mentioned, they all have impressive track records and design talents that I do covet. So it's a tough, like you saw that I had to really think about that. I had to really think about that.
What's the biggest tip you would have for aspiring game designers out there, of which anyone who plays board games regularly enough, I think at some point or another, considers themselves an aspiring game designer to a degree. What's the one tip you would have for someone who's looking to take it serious and maybe eventually get to basically full-time status like you've achieved?
Okay. The one thing that I followed was start small. So that's why I started with the small little card games. I wanted to start small and gradually build. And just once I got the confidence level to tackle on a more ambitious project, to go step by step. I think that would probably be the biggest advice I can give. It's just start small, work your way up to more grander and grander designs. Don't go for your very first game. Don't go with that super epic Gloomhaven killer game because you may not have the experience and refine your skills to the point that you're going to be able to produce the game that you want to make. So build up to it.
All right. Besides Metal Gear Solid, which has been taking up a ton of time, any other games in the pipeline that you're especially excited about that you can tell us about? Which maybe there's some that you can't. I don't know.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm restricted in mentioning this, but I did have a city building game.
Yes, you did say that.
Okay, I'm working with Arcane Wonders. I'm pretty sure I can mention that. Someone at the Dice Tower had mentioned it already, so I can talk about it. So it's a city building game with Arcane Wonders, and it is a family weight city building game where I believe the selling point of it is going to be some cool 3D malls that you get to build to actually make it look like a city.
Very cool.
So that's one thing, and I think they'll announce it later this year sometime.
So, city building game in the works. Do you know if it's going to be Dice Tower Essentials?
I believe so, yeah. I believe it's mentioned
Okay.
It's a Dice Tower's Essential game.
Got it. Very cool. Awesome. All right, I'm going to get to my final question. You may be prepared for this, you may not, but this is my final question in all interviews I do, Emerson. If you, Emerson Matsuuchi, could be one flavor of ice cream, what flavor of ice cream would you be and why? He is thinking about this one. I don't know if it's because the question is so strange or.
Yeah, actually, I'm thinking about what is the answer that you're looking for, because I had a knee-jerk answer, which was strawberry.
Is that because that's your favorite flavor of ice cream, or because you want to be strawberry ice cream?
It's my favorite flavor of ice cream. That's why I'm not sure. I don't think that's what you're asking.
Right. I'm asking if you could be a flavor of ice cream, and I found that for whatever reason, the answer to this tends to say something. For instance, Jamie came with his favorite one, which was Chocolate Decadence, which is a fantastic nickname, and I haven't brought it up in a while, but everyone should be calling Jamie Stegmaier Chocolate Decadence. But it, generally speaking, it tends to say something. So my answer to this tends to be mint chocolate chip. It's a brightness. It's got kind of an optimism and an energy to it, but it has the chocolate chips that kind of keep it grounded. There's still something that's kind of fundamentally solid and sound about it too. So that's my answer to that question. I also like mint chocolate chip, but it wouldn't be my favorite flavor of ice cream necessarily. So hopefully I've bought you enough time to come up with an answer to this very strange question.
Okay, it would be I believe it's called a Napoleon?
Neapolitan.
Neapolitan, I'm sorry. It's the one with the 3 flavors of ice cream inside the carton. And you can scoop it in one of 2 ways. You can go, if the carton was oriented horizontally, you can scoop horizontally to get all 3 flavors, or you can go vertically to get the flavor that you want. It's flexible. You can, it's got different flavors, so it's got variety built right into it. And that's probably the reason why that's the flavor of the ice cream I'd want to be.
All right. I like that answer. Although I will say, you technically cheated because I said if you could be any one flavor of ice cream, and you picked 3, which is pretty sneaky, Emerson, I got to say. Pretty sneaky stuff.
I'm pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, I hear you. Emerson, if folks want to get in touch with you for whatever reason, what's the best way to reach out or contact or say hi? What's the best way to do that?
Okay, I am at Nazca Games on Twitter and on Facebook as well. I think those are the 2 platforms that I probably more Twitter than Facebook. Well, that's usually the way to reach out to me.
And it's the best way if you want to get Metal Gear Solid spoilers. Just send him a direct message, and he'll get you all sorts of things. Emerson, thank you very much for the time, and thank you for all the awesome designs you've been putting out. I know a lot of people are very, very excited about Metal Gear Solid, and I'm sure there's some amount of nerves there too on your behalf. But at least from our discussion, it seems like it's in a good place right now.
I hope so. I really do. It is one of the most nerve-wracking projects to work on. It's because there's a whole lot of expectations around it. But I hope that the players, the consumers, do enjoy what we come up with.
Awesome. Emerson, thank you so much.
No, thank you, Alex. This was fun.